I'll say a few things about our upcoming events before I introduce our honored guest, Dr. Bjorn Krondorfer. And a few minutes ago, you saw some events that we are having. The next one is on March 25th, and it is on white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and racism, a conversation between Dr. Setzer, Claudia Setzer, who's a colleague of mine, and Eric Ward, who runs Western State Center. He is an amazing force, and he has been doing this kind of work on anti-Semitism and racism. Our event after that, in lieu of Ramadan, which begins April 12th, is on April 1st by Dr. Hossein Rashid, who will talk about the Quran and the first verse, the opening verse of the Quran. And then our third and final event for the spring is on April 8th for Yom HaShoah with Joan Shorm, who will talk about her father, who wrote, and she wrote the book My Dear Boy, where she discovers tons of letters from all over the world. She's an amazing woman, retired, but has done fabulous work, and also is doing a short film. So in lieu of that, I welcome you to all of those events, and I hope that you will join us. Everything is free, and you can register on Zoom. We're always happy to welcome people in our community, in Riverdale, and also nationally and internationally. So I wanted to just say a few words about Bjorn. Bjorn is a friend of mine. He's a colleague. He's somebody I've worked with. As a matter of fact, he is now the co-chair of the consortium of higher educational centers of Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, which I co-chaired with Wendy Lauer not so long ago. And I'm pleased to say, and very happy and honored to say, that we will be having our next conference at Manhattan College in the summer of 2022. So it will be, we're hoping about 40 to 60 centers that come together, and we discuss how Holocaust, genocide, and human rights connect with one another. So Bjorn and I have worked together on that committee, but we have also been friends. I have been at National Arizona University, and he has also been here at Manhattan College. So it's lovely to celebrate someone's work, especially your colleagues' work, that is so important today for us. And his book is entitled Unsettling Empathy, Working with Groups in Conflict. So how it's going to run is that I will introduce him, and then I will ask him a few questions. And then towards the end, after 40 minutes, we will take questions from the chat. And Ireland will ask those questions to Bjorn. Bjorn Krondorfer is the director of the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University and endowed professor of religious studies in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies. His field of expertise is religion, gender, and culture in post-Holocaust and reconciliation studies. In 2007 and 2008, he was the guest professor at the Institute of Theology and History of Religion at the Freie University Berlin, Germany. He has organized several international academic symposia and has mentored the creation of several exhibits, including in Riverdale, at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, Through the Eyes of Youth, Life and Death in the Betzin Ghetto, Resilience, Women, and Flagstaffs, Past and Present, and on the Berlin Wall. He has curated the art exhibits Wounded Landscapes in 2014, Echoes of Loss, Artistic Responses to Trauma in 2018. He has been awarded a 1-month residential fellowship at the Santa Fe Art Institute on the theme of Truth and Reconciliation 2019. His publications include his book that we are going to discuss tonight, but also The Holocaust and Masculinities, Critical Inquiries into the Presence and Absence of Men, Reconciliation in Global Context, Why It Is Needed and How It Works, Male Confessions, Intimate Revelations, and the Religious Imagination, and many more. So he, actually, I'm just reading this maybe for the first time aloud, Bjorn, and I'm realizing that you are in a very eclectic background and very interdisciplinary as religious studies people. So I celebrate that with you and welcome so much. So Bjorn, I want you to share with us your own history as a German man working with groups in conflict, and explain how you became a facilitator of these groups in conflict, and how did it bring you here? Could you explain that to us? So first, a little bit about your biography, and then perhaps shedding light on what this means to you as a facilitator of working with groups in conflict, which is very hard and demanding work.
Thank you, Menas, for inviting me, and thank you for all who are participating tonight. Before I start, just a quick shout out on a few colleagues and friends that I unexpectedly see joining us tonight from Arizona and from other places. David and Bernd and Wendy and Celia and Rick and Laura. It's just wonderful to have you with us tonight. I didn't expect it. I expected a Manhattan College community and student crowd, and I see lots of people that I do not know yet, and some people that I do. So when I walk around Flagstaff, Arizona, the gateway city to the Grand Canyon, and I go downtown and I go into a store and I say hello, first thing that people ask me, where are you from? After just saying one word. And I say, well, I'm not a tourist. I've been living in this country since 1983. I'm a dual citizen, but clearly my accent gives me away immediately. And most people realize it's somewhere in Europe, and many people second guess correctly that I was born in Germany. I came to the United States at age 24, too late to lose my accent in the English language. So that serves as a constant reminder that I'm both a citizen in this country as well as somehow always at the margins of it, because everyone recognizes that I'm not really American, legally American, but really you're also European, really you're also German. And often in the kind of work I do in conflict areas, but also as the director of the Martin Springer Institute here at Northern Arizona University, which was founded by a Holocaust survivor, I will be asked by people who are curious about what I, as a German, do in relationship to a very complicated, awful, tragic, traumatic history and legacy, which was perpetrated by my ancestors. I'm of non-Jewish background. I was born in Germany, and just to mention this here is important because what we talk about today, how to work with groups in conflict, whether these were past conflicts or present conflicts, it is quite important that whoever is running these programs, is facilitating, moderating, offering, whatever terms you want to use, you have to have done your homework. You have to be very clear about the closets in the skeletons in your closets, whether these are your family closets, whether these are your professional closets or the closets of your nation. You need to know the dark part of all of these and come to terms with them, have worked to them emotionally, intellectually, historically, if you want to run these programs. So in that sense, Menas, your question is good to start here. I could talk just a whole hour on this one, but let me just say one or two sentences about this in addition before you move on. When I came to this country in 1983, I started in a religious studies PhD program at Temple University in Philadelphia. And we were people from all over the world. We had Muslims from Kashmir, Muslims from Pakistan, Muslims from Syria. We had Buddhists from Thailand. We had a few Germans like myself who came from Protestant or Catholic traditions. And we had a number of Jewish American students who were taking the PhD program in addition to their rabbinical studies at the Reconstructionist College in Philadelphia. And it was very clear there was this strange attraction, this push and pull between the German students who were there for a year or two, or sometimes longer, as in my case, and the Jewish rabbinical students. Because we knew that the history somehow connects us, the history of the Holocaust somehow connects us, and we need to talk and come to terms with it. Embarrassingly, in retrospect, I knew nothing about Jews or Judaism when I came. I thought I know something, but pretty much what I knew were more or less prejudicial ideas about who Jews are. And much of my knowledge of Jews and Judaism kind of actually ended with 1945 in Germany. And that is with the image of photos that the Allies took of these heap of piles of Jewish prisoners who were executed or murdered in the concentration camps and death camps. And it never occurred to me to really think about what it would mean to be Jewish after 1945. Not that I didn't know they must exist. I just didn't occur to me to think about it. So I had very, very wrong perceptions. And so that was part of the long journey and the homework that one needs to do to come to terms with one's own legacy.
Okay, so, I mean, how did you, in a sense, you know, this book is, I think, really important because I feel that a lot of the times my students and people I speak to nationally and internationally ask me one question: what can we do? How can we have this dialogue? How can we talk across the divide? And I feel that this is what I meant in terms of explain how you came to do this kind of work in actually very tense areas in the world, whether we're talking about Palestine and Israel, whether we're talking about Germans and Jews, whether we're talking about even looking at apartheid, which you have done in South Africa. You've traveled all over the world, Bjorn. So how did you come to prepare yourself in terms of this role as somebody who is, you know, a scholar, an academic, a teacher, and how did you sort of say, okay, this is what I want to do?
It starts small and then expands over time. Besides my academic study, which helps it to clarify history, concepts, theory, religious, cultural ideas and differences, I was always interested in kind of the practical aspects of getting people together and get them to talk. And my frustrations in many dialogue groups in the 1980s and the 1990s were felt we exchanged more pleasantries and never getting to those really difficult issues that people just did not want to get to. I subsequently have called them either landmines or kind of sore subjects where when you step on them, you know, something unexpected might happen because you are rendered vulnerable in the presence of the other person. And it was never enough for me just to step around them. I wanted to step on these difficult issues and explore them with people. And it was not in academia, and it was not in interreligious dialogue groups. It was first through the people who are working with physical expressions, dancers and actors. So I started working with dancers and actors, and we actually performed for several years our own approaches to the history of the Holocaust as Jewish Americans and non-Jewish Germans in a mixed group, performing in the United States, but also performing in Germany, including East Germany, East Berlin, where we performed a few months before the wall came down. We actually got permission to travel there as the American-German group and perform in the Jewish community in East Berlin. And from there, I took it to work with students. I said, you know, I had my experience. I know how it works for myself. I came to terms to some extent with my own history, that this is important as an educational tool. So working with students was the first step. And that meant taking students of American Jewish background and have them meet German students of non-Jewish background and take them on a 4-week summer trip, 2 weeks in the United States and 2 weeks in Poland and in Germany. And constantly having them interact with each other and talk about what they just experienced. That was an educational approach. But that was heart-wrenching and personal and intimate and transformative for the students that were part of it. What made this easier, as I later realized, is that we were talking about a history that had come to an end. And now I'm talking about the Holocaust itself. I'm not talking about the ongoing anti-Semitic feelings, but the Holocaust itself as a traumatic history had come to an end. So it was a little bit easier for the next generation, the 20 and 30-year-olds in the 1990s and the 2000s to look back and try to figure out what we do with that legacy today. It becomes much more complicated if you work with groups in conflict, where the conflict is ongoing, where it has not come to an end, where there's no conclusion yet, where it had some beginnings, but there is no solution. And that would be, for example, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where there are traumatic histories, where there are traumatic legacies, difficult legacies, but no one has come up with a good solution, and people are still in the process. And so the mistrust is ongoing, and this requires a slightly different approach to the idea of bringing people together to find new ways of learning about each other, from each other, beginning to trust each other, and build up alternative ways of communicating.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. So, I mean, one of the things, you know, as I was reading your book, and I was honored to write a blurb for your book as well and share it with some of my students, was, you know, you ask in your first chapter this question that I think is really important. And you say, can the seemingly unforgivable be transformed into peaceful existence? Can you expand on that? Because I think you were sort of left off with saying, you know, I mean, we have stories, and some of them you mention in your book, and others have mentioned about forgiveness. Eva Kor becomes an example of forgiving, you know, the SS or the Nazis. I mean, how do we transform this into peaceful existence? I think it's a brilliant question.
Sure. The phrase of the unforgivable I borrow actually from Hannah Arendt, the political cultural theorist, philosopher from Germany of Jewish descent, who had to flee and had to contemplate what it means to be a refugee. And she asked she asked the question, like, should we forgive? And she says the real difficulty with that particular question is not to forgive what is actually forgivable. Like, where's the forgiving if you forgive something that is quite forgivable? I ate this extra piece of cake among siblings that was really yours, you know? And yeah, that is easy to forgive because it's not an unforgivable thing. But the real question is, can the unforgivable be forgiven? Can something like the Holocaust or some other genocides and mass atrocities, should we think about forgiving and the forgivable? And the answer is, the only way to think about it is to begin walking on a path towards better mutual understanding. There is no final answer, and there is no guaranteed result in any of the kind of work, at least with the groups that I am working with. There's no goal that says this is what we need to reach. It's like the only question we can either, you can say, repair or reckon with or reconcile or maybe forgive, a term I often don't use that much, is to actually be willing to walk on a path together and really encounter the other as exactly who the other is, and not as we wish them to be. That is, challenging your own ideas about who the other is or should be. You know, the other is always not the way how we want them to be, but can we still be in conversation with the person, fully with this person, even if they are different from who we are, and won't adopt our own perceptions.
Okay, so I don't have this as one of my questions, but I just want to stop there, because then I want to, now this is a perfect moment for us to talk about this idea of empathy, unsettling empathy. I mean, I just love that. That's just this sort of, you know, you think of empathy, oh, you know, have empathy for you. I mean, today in my class we talked about empathy and sympathy and apathy, right? I mean, what these terms mean, but the unsettling empathy, describe that for us, Bjorn, and what you mean by that, because you give two different definitions and you stay with the latter definition.
So empathy, you always need to define the terms that you use. For some people, sympathy is the better term than empathy. For some people, compassion is better than empathy, and you go through the explanation that you use. So for me, empathy is the ability to actually do more than put yourself in someone else's shoes. That's often what is, people say empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoe. That to some extent is correct. It is maybe a beginning, but it certainly is not all, and it cannot stop there. It needs to be much more active. So the term unsettling empathy is not to be read as saying, like, I want to unsettle empathy, as in deconstruct empathy, as to criticize empathy, but I mean it in the sense of an empathy that unsettles us, that unsettles me, an empathy that unsettles through the encounter with another person, with the group with whom we are in conflict, or that we think we are in conflict, that in this process, my understanding of the other person will be unsettled, that the understanding of myself will be unsettled, the understanding of how I see history will be unsettled, how I see the conflict in history will be unsettled, and even that my values that I hold dear, that we think are foundational for who I am in this world, may be unsettled in an encounter with the other person. So the term unsettling empathy is those moments in these processes when people come together who are in conflict with each other, where this unsettling happens, and it is at this very moment that something transformational happens in this very moment between the groups. Something changes in their level of trust, something changes in the level of understanding, in the willingness to understand. It is an uncomfortable realization when you get that unsettled, and it is the necessary stepping stone towards truly understand each other beyond simple sharing of stories that we accept or do not accept sometimes. And I hope that makes sense, but you need to tell me, Minas.
I mean, I think it does, because I think unsettling is really sort of what you're saying is how to understand, and how to understand that what we understand is not necessarily the truth about each other or about the other. And I think that's really important. And I think, in all my classes, and students are trying to struggle with this notion, right? And we're always trying to struggle with the idea of truth or the absolute or the authentic. And I'm constantly moving them away from this idea. And so it's very hard, because then it is unsettling, right? And it becomes more of a question of not the other, but one's own existence, in a sense. And I think that's what's so powerful about your discussion about empathy. But this takes me to a real life scenario, in a sense. So in the section, You Are What You Eat, you describe American Jewish and non-Jewish German university students who discuss the history and the legacy of the Holocaust and World War II, their third generation, whose grandparents went through this, a dinner scene. Could you describe this? It's a very interesting group, and perhaps I know that you have some pictures for us. You can show them right after, to show us what this looks like, this kind of group facilitation. Thank you.
So what you're referring to happened in the mid-1990s, and that was as part of these 4-week-long summer programs between American Jewish and non-Jewish German students, where they had to live with each other, travel and study with each other 24 hours a day almost. And so these were children, or mostly grandchildren, of those who experienced 1930s and 1940s as adults. So we're talking about what is, in the terminology that we use, the third generation after the Shoah, the third generation after the Holocaust. It was years before I was thinking of the term unsettling empathy. That hadn't crossed my mind at this time at all. But here's what happened. We just arrived in Berlin. We spent 2 weeks with this group of 20 students in the United States, where they met families of survivors and Jewish communities and the Holocaust Museum, all these kind of things. And we just arrived in Berlin first night in a group house where we stayed. And a typical German meal in the evening is not a hot meal, it's not the main meal, but it's like sandwiches. But you make your own sandwiches with cold meats and cheese. That's fairly straightforward and simple. One of the American Jewish students grabbed a piece of cold meat, like a slab of cold meat, took it in her hand, stood up from her seat during the communal dinner that we had, and threw this across the room and yelled, "Who wants to eat this shit?" There was embarrassed laughter. No one said anything. No one saw this coming. And then no one really talked about it for a while. And it was such a profound moment of puzzlement for the whole group, because we lived together for 2 weeks. We learned to understand each other. We liked each other. And there was this feeling that if someone takes this, that this was unwarranted. It came from nowhere. And so in my book, I explore the possibility that this could have been a less conscious obligation on her part to show her disrespect and her concerns and her anger against the German culture. And meat and food, not meat, but food is so fundamental to culture that if you take the food of your host country and throw it around the room with what she screamed, or yelled, what I just said, it kind of felt like she's actually saying, you Germans are shit. If you're eating this shit, then you must be shit. And it was not at all within the range of attitudes and thoughts that this person had showed us before. So it made me and made other people think, like, what really happened here? What kind of delegation and obligation did the person feel that she needed to express the first night in Germany as her reaction to a country that tried to annihilate her community and her extended family? And we tried to later bring this up in conversation, because you can't let these things go. They will fester in a group, but you need to bring it to the consciousness of the whole group, because a day or 2 days later, I heard Germans talking about this, not publicly, but in smaller groups, like, this is the arrogance of Americans, and I mean, just little nasty comments. And you can't let this slide when you work with groups and conflicts. You have to bring small things like this that happen in a group process to the attention of the group. I don't think in the 1990s we did the best job we could, but over the years I came up with ways to really move people to uncomfortable, in terms of formal processes, to uncomfortable places where we don't just sit around a table and talk like in academic settings or in classroom settings, but where we get up, we move, we improvise, we use our physical and bodily expressions to get to a different level of understanding. And I thought it would be good to just show you a few pictures that you get a sense of how that might look like. Otherwise it stays so abstract. So hopefully the sharing of the screen will work. I won't explain them. It's not the moment to explain them, but it may give you a sense of intensity. On the bottom left, this is a group with with students of my university from diverse backgrounds, Native American, Mexican American, Jewish American, meeting with Bedouin students and Israeli Jewish students in southern Israel on a tour to learn about the legacy and relationships between majority and minority cultures in Israel. And then the whole group traveled back to Arizona to do the same about Native American students or Native American culture and majority culture in Arizona, especially the Navajo and the Hopi. On the right-hand side, this is in Bethlehem, West Bank. This was a circle of shame. That wasn't their task, but that is what it evolved in among peace activists from the Palestinian and Israeli side. working through their own process. You begin to see that I am serious about not sitting in a circle. We sometimes do, obviously, and talk. And that the issues of trauma, and we're talking more about cultural and historical trauma than medical trauma or trauma in a therapeutic sense, how this affects different group settings. This is a Palestinian group expressing loss. This is a German group expressing their attitudes towards history of the Holocaust. You can immediately see like tense moments there. And just down here, actually see a group of Polish students to expressing their country's relationship to the history of the Holocaust. We are used to monuments. This is in Ravensbrück. We are used to monuments being taken down, as it happens in this country right now. And we can, in this work, improvisational work that tries to get to moments of unsettling empathy, we can recreate certain monuments and experience them to our own effective emotional responses, as well as intellectual responses. I always say memory work because it means that we are actively working through something rather than taking memory for granted. Memory also will be unsettled in these processes. The memories that we hold dear, or we think that these are the only dear memories and precious memories to have, can be unsettled in these processes too. This is a group of Jewish and German psychotherapists who live in Germany. Our 200-year present of personal touch is a wonderful exercise. We can come back later if you want to know how that is possible. Because the claim is that we have a history, a personal history of being touched over a span of 200 years, even if you only turn 70 or 80 years old. Recreating conflict through national sculptures, an Israeli sculpture, a Palestinian sculpture. And I think this is all I want to show right now. Yeah, that is correct. Just to give you a sense of whatever I say in the abstract really translates into real group work with people in different ways.
Wow, thank you, Bjorn. Just thinking about, by the way, if you want to ask questions, you can in the chat. Ireland, you've unmuted the chat, I hope. So I have a couple more questions. If you can say a bit more about memory and trauma. I'm very, very interested in that. But I also want you to speak in terms of transgenerational transmission, or the difference between medical, therapeutic trauma and historical and cultural trauma, right? So there's one that is kind of theoretical, and then there's one that is medical and therapeutic. And we find that when we do this study about trauma and memory, there's very little written about the cultural aspect. It's very kind of medicinal, at least in the research I'm doing on like Muslims and trauma and the wound. Can you say just a little bit about that in terms of how you approach that in your book and how you actually experienced it, because you were working with, transgenerational people?
Yeah. When you start doing this work, especially at these highly contested areas and these highly harmful legacies, like anything that has to do with genocide and atrocities on that is beyond the individual level, that involves collectives and communities and nations, one really needs to be conscious about how you integrate and how you use and how you talk about trauma. When working with groups in conflict, and if you're not a therapist, and I'm not, then you do not want to get to the individual trauma that people may have felt or experienced. It is not therapeutic trauma work. The trauma that is very much within the individual has a particular place, and that place has to be in a medical or therapeutic supervised space. I'm also saying that because when you work with groups in conflict, you have people who have been victimized, and you have people who are the perpetrators or the descendants of perpetrators, or the descendants of accomplices, or the descendants of collaborators, or beneficiaries, or opportunists, whatever it is. And so you can't really go into the individual traumatic space that people inhabit, because for a healing, if you have been personally traumatized, you need a space that is free of the other, that is free of the people who remind you of the perpetrators or who have been perpetrators. So we're talking about a different kind of trauma when working in groups in conflict. And here the terms historical and cultural trauma come in very handy, that can easily be found in the literature. Historical trauma would mean a trauma that happened in the past but has come to an end, but now gets, the memory of it gets transmitted through the generations. So that's one way of thinking about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. It is the memory of your parents or your grandparents. There could be stories, there could be objects, there could be more rituals. I mean, there's often memory objects that get passed on that are important to people. Or other people talk about cultural trauma, that is to say, traumas that started a long time ago, say slavery, but have come to an end, but the repercussions are still so strong that the trauma can be replicated even in today's terms, through systems, through institutions, through general accepted prejudices or biases, whatever have you. So in groups, you really work with cultural and historical trauma. You don't focus on the individual and bring people to talk about it. Now, the problem with trauma is that there are two problems. One is we have come to a place in our culture and in our history where everything is read through the lens of trauma. That you gain legitimacy if you can claim a certain amount of cultural or historical trauma. And you have to work, when you work with groups in conflict, you have to be a little bit of careful to what is a trauma that has gained kind of a meta legitimacy, a legitimacy that is maybe even supported by a nation state or by a larger narrative, by a master narrative, and perpetuated in a certain way to uphold, to actually keep the conflict going rather than to find a way to get away from the conflict. So the fine line in working with groups in conflict is to acknowledge traumatic past, to acknowledge the possibility of re-traumatization, and to help people reflect that even the trauma that you believe to be absolutely and unassailably true for you could be unsettled in the way how it has been transmitted to you from generation to generation, or through political narratives, commemorative narratives, and to also think about like what parts you want to hold on to that you will never let go of, and what parts are negotiable in the presence of the other person.
Thank you, Bjorn. Okay, just one question, and we go to the couple of questions that are in chat. So I'm teaching Brian Stevenson in my class, in my freshman class, 110. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is while I'm teaching and rereading your book and looking at it, my question is, how can we create empathy today in the U.S., especially the systematic racism in America? What do you suggest? Can we use your work on the art of witnessing that you do, and you show at the end of your book, to move us in dialogical ways of healing and confronting our own trauma?
I would say that as a culture, my new American culture, our American culture, we have not been unsettled by the legacy of slavery and by the legacy of post-slavery violence, post-slavery lynchings, post-slavery continued police violence against Black people or people of color in this country. we have not truly been unsettled by this in a larger communal collective sense. And I can see this every single time when I teach. I'm teaching right now a class on trauma representation in art and museums and memorial sites. And I ask my students to, I work with students through 4, 5, 6 lynching photographs, which my students acknowledge they may have seen 1 or 2, but never spent time thinking about it. And we spent an hour and a half thinking about a few select photographs of lynching and what you see and what you don't see, with whom you identify, with whom you not identify, from whose perspective they're taking, how we become complicit by watching these photos, how we can gain an acknowledgement of the complicity that has never been addressed, where this memory went, where the memory objects related to lynchings went. You may or may not know that people cut off the fingers of the lynching victims or pubic hair and all these things and traded them and passed them on in white families. Where did all of this go? It didn't disappear. And every single time I sense among my students this moment of being completely unsettled, meaning recognizing that, yes, there's a whole system through which they grew up in their families, in their churches, in their school education, and even mostly through the university, unless they take my class, that they never ask themselves the question of the degree of atrocious behavior and how normative and acceptable it had been only 60, 70 years ago. Where did this memory go? There's no active memory work around this issue. That would be one example where you can start with groups in this country to unsettle our perceptions of who we are and how we deal with a past that has not been reckoned with to the degree that it needs to be reckoned with. And I think much of that actually just reverberates in what we read in newspapers today. And coming from Germany, I can't help that our attitudes today, coming from Germany, knowing that the attitudes of my parents and myself were shaped by what happened in Germany, that the attitudes are shaped by an unrecognized, unacknowledged history in this country too. So we react to things, we don't actively respond to the events that we witness. And sadly to say, I cannot not see one of the results being the storming of the Capitol on January 6th.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, I have lots of other questions. I have a question like about gender and, men's history in terms of looking at this as well that you mentioned in one of your cases, which I just kind of want to put out there because I think that's really important in terms of shaping history and memory and trauma, which is always this masculine men's history, and then the women get left out. But there are other voices coming in these fields of trauma, Holocaust, genocide, that are bringing up the voices of women. So I think, Ireland, you have some questions in the chat if you want to ask Dr. Krondorfer.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm going to just kind of go in order of the questions. If the person who asked the question would like to say it, feel free, and if not, I can read it. But would David Cater like to read his question? Okay. If not, I can go ahead and read it. So a question for Bjorn, if I might, when it fits in the programs you generated that seek engagement between individuals from different stories, hoping for unsettling empathy, is stunningly courageous. However, it seems the participants have to be at some meaningful level inclined to engage and maybe even achieve unsettled empathy. What is possible? I think maybe nothing between not second and third generations of victims and victimizers, but first generation individuals. And the question's also in the chat, Bjorn.
Yes. Obviously, I get asked this question quite often in the sense of, isn't that a hopeless enterprise? Like you bring in a few individuals at a time, and you go through these intense encounters. They last 3 to 5 days, or in some cases, as I mentioned before, 4 weeks. And what is the ripple effect, or is an effect to the larger society? And who comes? Well, obviously, only people come who feel discontent with the situation within which they live. And for some, it's the first time they want to figure out what the reason of the discontentment is. And other people come because they've tried various ways of engagement, from political activism to writing letters, whatever it is that they were doing. And they feel they're stuck. And they want to understand themselves better and understand the other person better in these processes. I have no illusion that these programs will immediately affect the macro level changes. So if you meet with Palestinians and Israelis in the West Bank or in Germany or in other places, it's not going to suddenly change and end the occupation or bring the wall down or something like this. But it does create communities of people who have learned to listen to each other and have learned that you can actually accept and live with the other person despite differences. The idea of these processes is never that you have to adopt the other person's perspective, but you have to understand the other perspectives, and for a few moments as if it's your own. And then, of course, you realize I'm still myself. Yeah, I'm not a Palestinian. I'm not Jewish. I'm not whatever, Armenian. I'm someone who is still, I am, but you understood where they come from. So, yes, we don't start with the most radical elements because they wouldn't come. We start with those people who have a genuine interest in moving us to a better place. And that is tough work already, even with people who are willing. And David, I hope I answered it a little bit.
Great. Our next question is by Rachel Rudansky. Would you like to ask, or you can also read it?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this important discussion. I just had a quick question. I was wondering if the work of Bert Hellinger has something that you know of, and if you find that an interesting way of bringing that work into these type of communities. Thank you.
I know a little bit. I've heard about his work. I know a little bit about his work. I know about these family constellation works that people do. I've participated in one or two, and they're good elements. Like in many of these examples where people work in this area, they're great ways and different ways of approaching it. I found myself to really focus on the group dynamics rather than on individual stories. I found myself to work to have an eye always on the dynamics that happen within a group setting rather than focus on the particular family story of one person where other people then get placed into a position and have to take on the person's father or grandmother or friend or lover, whatever have you. Because to me, I mean, that's helpful for the person who's the protagonist, but not necessarily helping us for 2 or 3 or 4 groups or 2 groups that are in conflict as a community rather than as individuals. So my focus is always, it doesn't neglect individual stories, but the individual stories feed into our understanding of seeing who we are as a community and who we are within our own community. So that would be the difference.
Thank you. You did say that. Thank you very much for clarifying. Thank you.
Great. So our next question I've been asked to read, and it's your thoughts about Dan Barron, if I'm saying that correctly. He was a psychologist, and I participated in some of his encounters with children of survivors, as well as Israeli and Palestinian encounters.
Yeah, many connections to Dan Barron, an Israeli social psychologist. Actually, we have a Martin Springer Institute here in northern Arizona, We have a Martin Springer Center of Conflict Studies at Ben Gurion University in honor of Dan Bar-On's work. So we actually collaborated with them or collaborate with them right now. Dan Bar-On was a fantastic person. I had a chance to meet him a few times. He did 2 or 3 different things. One is he went back to Germany, where his family came from, and interviewed children of high-ranking Nazis, and to kind of get an understanding of who are these children. Some of whom wanted to learn from history and the legacy, and some who were defensive and remained defensive their whole life. Defensive meaning defending their parents' actions, one way or the other. And other people were so troubled by their parents' past that some of them were suicidal, actually. Some of them refused to have children because it's like nothing good can come out of my DNA with my heritage. Some people married Jewish Israeli partners. The whole broad spectrum of how children of high-ranking Nazi families interacted. And he was the first to do in-depth interviews with them as an Israeli from a family of Jewish people who survived. And then much of what he learned, he brought them back into similar kind of group work that expanded to all kinds of conflict areas: Ireland, South Africa, Palestine, and eventually also expanded it to understand the relationships between Israeli and Bedouins and Israelis and Palestinians, and brought people together. He died way too soon of brain cancer prematurely. Otherwise, I'm sure our paths would have crossed much more often.
Great, thank you. We have 2 more questions. This question says, you mentioned Hannah Arendt's work earlier. Have you been influenced by other theorists of memory work, and how has that affected your thinking through of your ideas about unsettling empathy? Do you think, for example, that Marianne Hirsch's idea of post-memory is helpful for intergroup dialogue? When you were talking about generational trauma, this is the concept I keep thinking about.
Yeah, Marianne Hirsch's concept is an important one, not the only one, but it's an important one to talk about post-memory and post-generations, to kind of indicate the fact that the memory that's being passed on from one generation to the next, and especially from victimized communities, and in her specific case, mostly, but not only, survivors from the Holocaust, that the memories that the second generation carries are not the same memories of their parents. They are select memories. They are sometimes memories that are based on forgetting certain aspects. They adopt memories that become so centrally part of their own individual identity that it's hard for them to separate between their family, their parents' trauma, and their own life. So she looks at it both in a critical sense, but also simply in a descriptive sense, saying like, these things happen, and we need to remember that the post memories that we have are not the same as our parents or grandparents have them. And that is really important to realize that what is important is to realize what memories we want to keep and carry on, and what memories we want to let go of. Because not all memories that are passed on to us are memories we want to pass on to our children's and children's children. They may have to stay with us. That might be particularly true for descendants of perpetrators, because we as children or grandchildren of perpetrators, we may have had memories or touches or stories told by our family members that we definitely want to stop with us because they were toxic. They were contaminated. They were one-sided. They were selective, and so on and so forth. So I think it is always in our power, when we become conscious of memories, to know what are our memories, what are adopted memories, and which ones need to stay with us and not to pass them on. Because sometimes passing on traumatic memories feeds a conflict and doesn't recognize the conflict.
Okay, we have one more question. It's because it's Rabbi Bob Kaplan, our friend and board member. Arlen, you want to read that? And we'll just go about 5 minutes over. That's it. I hope that's okay, Bjorn.
Great. So this last question is, can unsettled empathy be seen as a direct effect of the unrestrained honoring of the dignity of the other?
Well, can you read this again?
Yes. So can unsettled empathy be seen as a direct effect of the unrestrained honoring of the dignity of the other?
Yes, I would say yes. Because if you don't, if you cannot honor the truth that the other brings to the table, then unsettling empathy hasn't happened. What has happened maybe is that I listen to your stories. I say, great, thank you. I don't tell you what I think about them, but I say, thank you for your story. And in the mind, I say like, no, this was a terrible story, but I'm not telling this to you. And then it's my turn to tell the story, and the other person says, yeah, thank you for your story, which would be a caricature of compassionate listening. If that means only you tell a story, I tell a story, and that's all we do. Unsettling empathy takes it a step further, that we respond to another person's story, that we have the honesty and ability to say to the other person, I'm sorry, I don't believe this part in your story, or actually this part of your story makes me really angry, even though if the story was told truthfully. And then have the other person respond to you, to engage with the stories we tell, to engage with the stories, the memories that we share. And it's precisely that we find the dignity and respect in these moments of conflict that is the restoring of dignity to the other person, which is what unsettling empathy enables us to do. And maybe one more word. It's not only a willingness to be unsettled, but you also have to learn the ability to transform this unsettling feeling into something productive and forward-looking.
Wow, that's a perfect ending. Bjorn, thank you so much. I hope that this is just a beginning of a conversation, right? About thinking about how to have these dialogues with groups in conflict. But I also think it's so timely for us here in the United States in terms of how do we confront our own history? What do we do with that? What kind of memories have we been allotted with, and how have we been constructed in terms of our memories of either the Native American genocide or the African American genocide, I would argue. But if you want to get his book, here it is, Unsettling Empathy by Bjorn. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and I think we should give him all a hand so you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much.
Bravo.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Bjorn, if you can just stay for a bit.
Sure.